Hi, how are you? So good to be here. Well, that's very kind of you. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. Yeah. Yeah, so lately what's really been engaging my mind is this next book I'm working on. So I wrote Hooked for two very specific reasons. I wrote Hooked, number one, to help product makers. So I wrote the book about 5 years ago. I started working on it more than 10 years ago, but it came out about 5 years ago. And the book was written, number one, to help product makers make the kind of products that people want to use, but for lack of good product design, don't use. That's really what killed me. What I was writing the book for is that I was looking for a book to explain to me how to build the kind of products to help people build healthy habits. And I couldn't find that book out there, so I decided to write it for myself. And that's been fantastic. It's really been amazing to see over the past 5 years since the book came out about how people are using the Hook model for good. Companies like Paga, which is bringing millions of previously unbanked people in Africa online, getting them bank accounts. Companies like Kahoot, which I invested in. It's the largest educational software in the world. If you have kids who are in grade school age, mention Kahoot, they'll go crazy. They all use it. If you think about companies like Seven Cups in the psychotherapy space, another company I invested in, so many of these companies have used the Hook model for good to help people live healthier, eat right, exercise more, all of these good things that people can do when they form healthy habits. And of course, on the business side, the benefit is that you can get people to use your product without having to constantly send them spammy messages and expensive marketing, spend a lot of money on marketing. So there's real big, there's significant business advantages to forming a customer habit. And of course, real advantages to the consumer as well if they can change their life by forming this healthy habit. And then the second part of why I wrote Hooked was that I saw that technology was changing my own behavior in ways that I didn't always understand. And I wanted to dive deeper into the psychology of, how do companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and Slack, how do they change our behavior in ways that sometimes we don't always understand, we don't always like. And so my second book that's coming out in September, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in the coming months, is really about how do we put distraction in its place, not just technological distraction, but all sorts of distraction. So that's really what has been getting me up in the morning professionally lately. It's really about finishing that book. And I think I came up with the answer to that question. I think I really cracked the code. And I think I could do that because I've been so immersed in helping companies build habits that I know the cheat codes. I know the secret formula, which means that I also know how you can break these unwanted habits in our lives.
Which I love because we are going to dive deeper into that. Guys, if you haven't heard me before, hopefully you're hearing me now. Let me know, put a thumb up. This should work. And of course, come in to am.geek.com/live and you'll be able to talk to us face to face. Because we are going to have a little bit of an exercise coming up where Nir doesn't know this, but we're going to actually help you guys find triggers with the 5 whys model technique. So if you want to have that happening in real time, hop on over to am.geek.com. So Nir, you are an investor, you are a consultant, you are an author, you've done so much in your life. I want to know, what was it like at the very beginning? Because when I started my career, I definitely did not have the skills that I have now. What did you kind of experience when you started diving into product psychology and really writing your book?
Yeah, so I started actually not as an author. I never thought I'd be an author. I always liked writing. I was a journalism major in school because I just always liked exploring my curiosity and that aspect. But then I didn't decide to become a journalist. I actually decided after college to go into management consulting. I went to work at BCG. And then after that, I started a company. I started a solar energy business, kind of like a very small scale Solar City, which was much smaller scale, but it was actually before Solar City. We started that business around it was 2003. So this was This was way before the current boom in solar, but thankfully we started that company. It was acquired. Then I went to business school, and then at business school, I was a co-founder of another company, and this company was very different. It was in the advertising and gaming space. Oh. And it was very well timed in that we were in this space just as the Facebook ecosystem was exploding. So this was 2007, 2008. This was when, Facebook was just starting to get huge, and people were building apps that were able to spread to millions of people in, a few days. For the first time, you could have this amazing viral coefficient. And what I saw in that experience was that I saw all these companies, get to amazing growth rates. They would bring so many people into their product. They nailed growth, but they didn't nail engagement. And so I learned this GEM model. This actually came from Reid Hoffman out of LinkedIn, where he says that, you need 3 pillars of every successful company. You need GEMs. You need growth, you need engagement, and you need monetization. And, you could find, this was around the same time, the term growth hacking was invented by Sean Ellis, and people started finding ways to growth hack their companies. And I felt like monetization was kind of an understood field around, how to actually monetize your customers. But I felt like engagement was something that people really didn't understand. How do you keep people coming back to your product or service? Because for many companies, if you can't keep your customer coming back, if you have to spend money to bring them back through ads and spammy messages every time, you go out of business. So if you don't understand how to get people to use your product on their own out of habit, a lot of companies have a really big problem. And so that's why I focused on that realm, because I was at this epicenter of these tech companies who really nailed engagement. I mean, if you want to get really good at something, you got to look at the best in the business. Yeah. And nobody nails engagement as well as some of these tech companies we described earlier. So that's really why I was so curious to understand the code behind how to build habit-forming products.
I love that you are talking about engagement, because that's my core thing. I always say people come to me when they're done branding, when they're done funnels, when they're done doing all that stuff, and now they need someone to pay attention to them and actually engage with their content. That's when we start having a conversation, because it's so important, right? What do you think is at the core of engagement nowadays? Because you wrote the book in 2014. Now, 5 years later, there's a lot of AI, there are a lot of ad blockers, right? We're kind of like overwhelmed with everything that's going on right now, that our attention is not where it used to be 5 years ago. So I'm sure, the book and the model really do apply, but there are probably nuances that you discovered throughout the years that, apply more to what we're doing today. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, it's amazing. So I did a 5-year revision. So my publisher asked me to look back through the book and walk through it all and actually look at all the examples and all the companies I mentioned. And with very rare exception, all of the companies that I kind of spotted early as really these masters of engagement and retention are still doing great. If anything, the company that's taken the biggest hit is Facebook. And I think the reason I talked a lot, Facebook I use as this company that has really nailed engagement. They really understand what I call the hook model, which we can get into a little later, really, really well. But what's interesting is just because you build a customer habit doesn't mean you've got that habit for life. I mean, if you have a customer habit, it's a huge competitive advantage, right? It's very difficult for the competition to swoop in and take your customer away. There's probably no better example than Google, right? One of the things that forming a habit does for you is that, if the definition of a habit is a behavior done with little or no conscious thought, what that means is that customers will use your product without even giving the competition a chance. Think about that. When you Google something, do you ask yourself and say, I wonder, does Google still have the best search engine? Maybe I should give Bing a try. No, you just do it. You just Google something with little or no conscious thought. Poor Bing doesn't stand a chance. So once you have that habit, it is a huge competitive advantage. Now, you can lose it. I think what we see today with Facebook is that, I talk about the hook model, these 4 basic steps of a trigger, action, reward, and an investment. And the hook can certainly break. If one of the elements of the hook is deficient, I think what's happening right now with Facebook is that people don't find it rewarding. So that 3rd step of the hook, the reward phase, people find it's not fulfilling anymore, and they're going to alternatives. They're using Instagram instead. They're using Snapchat instead. They're using something else because Facebook proper isn't doing it for them anymore. So you could certainly, there's lots of examples of companies that had the hook nailed, had a customer habit, and for one reason or another lost it. But it takes time. It's one of the advantages of a habit is that unlike companies that don't have a habit, companies that don't build a habit constantly compete on two things: features and price. That's all they compete on: features and price all day long. Companies that form a habit, however, don't compete on those factors anymore. They lock in the customer's behavior, and they don't, they find that customers are less price sensitive. They don't have to constantly upgrade features because customers are using the products habitually.
And I love that, because that also gets into referrals and word of mouth and retention. I just want to say hi to the people who have joined us. Danny Melinder, is that right, Danny? He says, you distracted me here. I was busy writing, and then I got distracted, and now I'm watching the show. So come on over. It'll be nice to meet you.
Welcome.
And then he says that he finds Facebook way too distracting. So I get that. And when we're talking about even Google, right? You say, hey, I don't need to think about Google. I just Google it. It's now a verb. Google has been slowly destroying trust, right, in their top users. When they close Google Plus, for me, 90,000 followers, engagement, everything's done, right? And right. There's a webpage, Google Graveyard, of all the products that they kind of try to put out there, and they're like, it's not working. And when people rely on those products for their own business, they're going like, what? Let me find something else that is not Google that's going to last for the long run. So how many companies have you seen that started out, and you mentioned a few, that they grow so amazingly and it's like everything is going on, and then they lose trust? How do they mess it up for themselves?
Well, so let me start with this. The most common situation is not that a company forms a habit and loses it. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of companies don't have that problem. The vast majority of companies can't figure out how to build a habit in the first place. Wow. And when it comes particularly to small businesses, I'm frequently asked about, is Facebook and Google and YouTube, are these products too habit forming? And I tell people that the real problem is not that a few companies like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are sucking us in. The real problem is that far too many products suck, right? That's the real problem. If you think about the kind of products that we have to use at work, right? Enterprise software, most of it is horrible, right? It's such a pain to use. Yeah. Think about government services, local small businesses. These products need to use these techniques more, right? The problem is they're not engaging enough. And so that's the problem that by and large, I see out there. Very rarely do I hear of a company that comes to me and says, oh my God, people are over engaging with my product. What they tell me is that nobody gives a shit, right? Like, we built this great product that people would love if they only used. How do we get them to actually continue to use the product? But you can get situations like you mentioned before. Maybe this is actually a good time to walk you through the 4 steps of the hook model.
Yeah, let's do that.
You'll see exactly where this question of trust and how trust can break the hook model if you lose a customer's trust comes into play. So real quick, I'll give you the 30,000 foot version. There's a lot more in the book Hooked, which you can see behind me, that has exercises and a lot more than we have time for today. But basically, the 4 basic steps that we see in all sorts of habit forming products, online and offline, are these 4 basic steps of a trigger, an action, a reward, and finally an investment. So trigger, there are 2 types of triggers: external triggers and internal triggers. Internal triggers are the promised land. Internal triggers are what we are trying to get to. If you can get your product to attach to some kind of internal emotional state, this is, if there's one takeaway from today's talk that I want everybody to remember, is that there's only one reason why people use any product or service. It doesn't matter what your product or service is, there's only one reason, and that reason is to modulate our mood, to make us feel something different. So the first step in building a habit-forming product is to understand, what is that itch? What's the internal trigger? What's the uncomfortable emotional state that your customers turn to with sufficient frequency to alleviate with your product? Some examples. When we're lonely, we check Facebook. When we're uncertain, we Google. When we're bored, we check the news or YouTube or stock prices or sports scores. All of these things cater to an uncomfortable emotional state. And it doesn't matter if your product is an enterprise, if it's a service, if it's a product, doesn't matter. It has to understand, you have to understand, what is that internal trigger, that emotional state. Then the next step is the action phase. So this is the simplest thing done in anticipation of a reward. And your job as the product maker is to reduce the friction to doing the action you want the user to do. And there's lots and lots of ways that we can reduce friction, but that's the most important lesson. We can get into the details in a bit. This is actually where trust is super important, because if the user has to think before they use your product, is this product gonna be here next month? And are they gonna do the right thing with my information? And do I trust this company? That is what we call cognitive friction or cognitive load. And that's where they will not progress if they don't trust you. So that's where trust would fall into the action phase. The next phase is called the variable reward phase. And this is where the user gets what they came for. If they don't trust, their psychological itch is scratched. And what we find is that these habit-forming products, they use what's called an intermittent reinforcement. This is a variable reward. So it's not that you give the customer what they want every single time. It's that there's a bit of uncertainty, a bit of mystery around what they might find, which in fact scratches the user's itch. But there's unpredictability there. And there's a lot of really interesting psychology around variable rewards. We see them in all sorts of things. Of course, we see them in casinos. We see them in sports matches. We see them everywhere. Everything that's engaging, a good book, a good movie, and of course, your news feed, all of these things utilize variable rewards. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the investment phase, the last step of the hook. This is where the user puts something into the product in anticipation of some kind of future benefit. They put in data, content, followers, they accrue a reputation, something that makes the product better and better with use, which brings them back in the future by loading the next trigger. So for example, when you send someone a message on WhatsApp or Slack or any number of other messaging services, you load the next trigger because you're likely to get a reply. And that reply comes back in the form of an external trigger, which is where we started this whole hook. An external trigger is something in our environment that tells us what to do next. A ping, a ding, a ring, something that tells us what to do next, which prompts us through the hook once again. Okay, so those four basic steps of a trigger, action, reward, investment, that is the model for all of these habit-forming products. And if your product is used frequently enough, and the frequency test is about a week's time or less, you can use these four steps to make sure that your product is one that has the likelihood of becoming a habit.
I love it. Because some of the stuff that you're talking about sounds a lot like gamification, right?
Yes and no. So gamification has some elements that can be used to change behavior, but gamification doesn't necessarily have to do with habits per se. Gamification is when we use game-like mechanics in non-gaming environments, points, badges, leaderboards. And I'm not the biggest fan of gamification because I think most people apply it incorrectly. There are some use cases where it works great. For example, if the internal trigger is boredom, then gamification is great. Points, badges, and leaderboards make something that is boring. So potentially, if the user wants to be entertained, then gamification can make it entertaining. But they have to come with that problem. You can't come and do what's called making chocolate-covered broccoli, where we take something that sucks and we put chocolate on it and we hope it makes it delicious. That doesn't work. But if the user is coming to your product because they're bored, well then gamification is great at making something potentially entertaining. However, if the user came to you because they're stressed, they have anxiety, their workplace is chaotic and they need a solution so that they can feel in control, adding points and badges and leaderboards is just freaking annoying and it doesn't make the product better. So the question is, it's not that gamification is always bad. It's just it has to be used in the right circumstances based on the internal trigger, based on what psychological state the user is looking to escape.
So, I'm in the mindset that gamification works very well when there's value, right, attached to the points, attached to the levels, to the badges, right? So if a badge is a degree from Harvard, which is the same thing basically, right? You worked for 3 years, you got this badge, I have a degree, and that has value in the market, then there's internal motivation to achieve that, right? For recognition, for financial, whatever, right? But when gamification, it's like, okay, I am in a leaderboard with people that I don't know. Okay, yeah. You can be 10%.
Exactly, and I don't really care to achieve what this program is making. A lot of times people use gamification to make a shitty task, more fun, and that almost never works. What it can do is make something. If the user is coming to be entertained, then those are mechanisms that can be used to entertain the user.
So, so on the same level of gamification, airlines have done a fantastic work with this, right? Because if we have a credit card with 100 airline points, we're not going to let go of the credit card because there's value to the points, right? So when you start with that type of, internal motivation where you have, because you have to start with an external one to get to the internal one. Am I right? Or is it kind of like, doesn't matter?
So that's absolutely true. So the external trigger is how we get someone through the hook in the first place. So you need that prompting, that notification, the email, some piece of information that says, here's what you should do next. But of course, the long-term goal is to no longer require those external triggers. So when you start first using Instagram for example, you start using it at first because you get these notifications, but then after a while, you start forming this habit based on the internal trigger, based on the fact that you're feeling bored, you're seeking connection, there's some kind of emotional state that you're looking to escape, and then you no longer need the notifications at all. You're using the product habitually on your own with little or no conscious thought.
I love it. And actually in your course, you have a product psychology course, guys. It's completely free. It's 6 modules in PDFs that you can download. And if you want access to that right to the right of this video on thatgeek.com, you have a link that will take you straight there, and you can grab that product and you can subscribe to Nir's newsletter, which is fantastic, by the way. So in that product, you are talking about emotional engagement, right? And how to design products with the heart in mind. And you mentioned the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, I think I'm saying it right?
Yeah.
And he found that when people lose the ability to express emotions, they cannot make up their mind, which is amazing to me, right? And so then you ask us to identify which of the customer's emotion guide them to engage with our products. But what we're talking about, like a lot of stuff that we've seen in the last year or two, since the election, is very much fear-based, right? Like trauma and like, oh my God, what's going to happen to you? And loss and fear. Do you think that, well, on my hand is like, I think that a lot of that stuff puts us in a state of stress that we can't concentrate and we can't achieve anything. We can't complete it because we're like, something's going to happen on one hand. And on the other hand, it's like a lot of marketers say, well, when I talk to the heart and the good and aspiration, it doesn't sell as well. So how do you balance both?
Well, so here's the thing. This is a kind of a cataclysmic revelation that a lot of people don't realize. We for decades, the belief has been that human motivation comes through what Freud called the pleasure principle, that humans seek pleasure and avoid pain.
Right.
And a lot of models, actually one model that I referenced in the book, the fog model, still uses that. But in actuality, if you dig a layer deeper, even the pursuit of pleasure is about the satiation of pain. That wanting something, craving something, even something good, is itself desirous because we want to quell the pain of wanting, the stress of desire. So the fact is, all human behavior is motivated by the desire to escape discomfort. It's called the homeostatic response. When we go outside and it's cold, we put on a coat. And when it's hot, we take it off. When we are hungry, we eat, and that, because we feel hunger pangs. And then when we're stuffed, that doesn't feel good, we stop eating. So those are all physiological responses, but the same exact truth applies to psychological circumstances. When we're feeling lonely or bored or indecisive or fatigued or stressed, whatever it might be, these are the drivers of all of our behavior, believe it or not. And so, and that's why, I always tell people who are making a product to tell me what is the pain point. Not the good stuff. Tell me what hurts. Why? Because that's actually what's so amazing about our career choice as product builders, as entrepreneurs, as designers. We have the ability, we have the mission of solving for people's pain. If they're not in pain, leave them alone. I'll tell you a quick anecdote that illustrates the point. I was on a transcon flight and I was sitting in the aisle seat. And across from me was this gentleman who was knocked out. He was completely asleep. He had, his blanket tucked up to his chin. He had a big pillow, and he was sitting there in the aisle seat, totally asleep. Meanwhile, the flight attendant comes by, and she stops the cart, and she says, "Sir," he's asleep, right? Everybody around him can see. She says it louder. She says, "Sir," and again, he doesn't wake up. Finally, she kind of screams at him. She says, "Sir," and he wakes up. "Whoa, what is it?" And she says, "Sir, what would you like to drink?"
Oh my God.
So this is a great example of why it's so important to only reach out to people when they are in pain. Would that man have liked a drink? Absolutely, when he was thirsty, not when he was asleep. And we do this to our customers all the time. We send them these notifications, and this gets to your question about why the good, it doesn't do as well as the bad. We send them notifications about, wouldn't you like this, and wouldn't you like this, and wouldn't you like this, when what we really need to be doing is to understand, when do they feel the internal trigger? The time to come and ask that guy if he wanted a drink was when he was awake and thirsty, not when he was sleeping and didn't want to be bothered. Right. And so that's why it's so important to understand, when does your customer experience the itch? When do they experience the internal trigger? And that's when you want to send them the external trigger. That's when you want to send them the notification to say, here's how we can solve the problem that you're experiencing right now.
I love it. You know, it reminds me of an Israeli comedian who goes like, okay, ladies, you know, when a man is asleep on the sofa, don't wake him up to be like, hey, go to bed, you'll be more comfortable there. It's like, I'm already comfortable, I'm asleep.
Exactly.
So it's exactly the same thing. So let's talk about, you were saying triggers and knowing exactly when to ping that person. And that goes into another thing that you're talking about in the product psychology course, which is, who do you trust? Do you trust the data, or do you trust your users? Right? Because when Freud is very famously said that if I asked them what they wanted, they would say faster horses. Right? So a lot of people going like, the users don't know what they want. We need to tell them, the data will show. What do you think? You know, what's the balance between the two?
Yeah, so it starts with understanding the deeper motivations. And I agree. You know, this is a problem that we had at my last company. And I think every company has this problem, this key question of, what do we build next? And, you know, we today have evolved from what used to be called the waterfall methodology, where we would stick a bunch of engineers in a room. We'd say, build this, build this, build this, and we want you to build it by this date. And of course, they were always late. And then once they actually delivered the product, we would let customers try it out. And 9 times out of 10, customers didn't like what we had built them. But now we've evolved. Now we use lean product techniques, right? We use lean startup techniques. If you've read Lean Startup by Eric Ries, great model. We do what's called the build, measure, learn loop. We build an MVP, a minimum viable product, and we've evolved to involve customers sooner in the product development process. But there's a big problem with this technique. You see, build, measure, learn makes it look like each of these 3 steps should have equal weighting, that they're equally difficult. And that's not true. It's not Eric Ries's fault. I love the technique. I think this is a problem of perception, because if you take a step back and you think about it, you know, what's the most expensive, time-consuming part of the build, measure, learn loop? Where does all the blood, sweat, and tears and the money all go? Measure? It goes into the building, right? No, the measure. Yeah, the measuring, once you've set up a measuring infrastructure, once you have a reporting system, that's easy. The learning part, well, you have a few meetings, you look at the data, and now you've learned something. Building is expensive. Building is where the blood, sweat, and tears and money all go. And so what I find is that one of the biggest problems that companies had, and we certainly had this problem, is how do you prioritize what to build? Do you build what the loudest customer says we should build? Do you build what the hippo, you know who the hippo is, right? The highest paid person's opinion, right? Do you build what the boss says we should build? Worst case, you know, worst thing you can do is build what the investors think you should build. That's never the answer, usually. So instead, what I think you should do is, instead of building, you know, what the loudest customer says we should build, because many times, you know, the customer, they can't articulate what they want. As you mentioned earlier, that famous Henry Ford quote, people oftentimes don't know what they want. And so how do we address what we call these inarticulatable needs, the needs that customers have that they can't tell you they need? And so the first step is to have a model, is to have a framework based on some very old, very established consumer psychology research. That's what the hook model is for. You know, you don't need to do any coding. You don't need to hire a designer. You just ask these 5 fundamental questions around the hook model. Number 1, what's the internal trigger? Number 2, what's the external trigger that prompts users to action? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, number 5, what's the bit of work the user does to invest in the product and increase the likelihood of the next pass? Once you answer those 5 questions, you can diagnose the problem, and that's your answer for what you should build next.
I love it. We're going to take a little commercial break. just to let you guys know that we are switching into the user interactive session of the show. So let's do that. And then whoever wants to raise their hand, if you guys haven't done it yet, thatgeek.com/live. Let's take a little break. So guys, the interactive part of the show, we are going to dive in specifically how to find what the triggers are. And we're going to let you speak with Nir face to face to do that. Before we do that, Nir, let's just talk about, some of those triggers, because like you mentioned, notifications, sending them in the wrong time. A lot of people, like myself, I remove all notifications from my phone. I sometimes even mute it completely throughout the day so that it doesn't bug me. As a marketer, as a business owner, how do you know when stuff is like completely annoying? How do you know when it's helpful? How do you know okay, I should bug them, or until they tell me no, and then I learn that this is not the right way, and then I'll change it. What's the right way of going about that stuff?
Yeah. So there's one word that separates an external trigger from one that feels like spam and one that feels like magic, right? An external trigger is one of these pings, these dings, these rings, these notifications. There's one word that separates these notifications that feel like spam, that feel like annoying, and the ones that feel like magic. And that word is context. So the closer together you can couple the external trigger with the internal trigger, the more effective it will be and the more appreciated it will be, right? If you can send that external trigger, the moment the customer feels that pain point, that's when it's going to be most effective. So that's really the secret. You have to understand the context of when the customer needs your product. When do they feel that pain point? And there's a lot of data that we can use to pinpoint that. A big source is past use information, right? When did my customer use my tool last? How did they use it? What context were they in? And then just some simple, thinking through your customer's experience. Are they using it first thing in the morning at work? Are they using it when they get home? What's the context for when they would be most likely to have the internal trigger? And therefore, that's when we should send them the external trigger.
Got it. So let's dive into the 5 whys model, and let's talk about what it is. And then Stuart here is going to be a little guinea pig where we can try it on. So what is the 5 whys model? Why does it work? And would you use it with yourself, kind of like, okay, well, I think that my user wants this thing, and then why, right? Or do you actually go out and ask your audience what they think?
So the 5 whys technique actually I didn't invent the 5 whys technique. It came out of the Toyota processing system. And the idea is to understand the deeper causes, the root cause analysis of why something would happen. And so what we tend to see is that, people tend to focus on the first why. Something breaks in a factory and they say, well, why did this happen? Well, because Joe was asleep. Well, why was Joe asleep? So you keep going down why until you figure out the root cause, not the proximal cause. So what I did was to kind of adapt this technique of the 5 whys to understand what the customer's internal trigger is, to go deeper from the functional need to the psychological need of why someone would need the product. And the reason we want to do that is because if we stay very functional, then we're trapped in our little cave of only giving the customer what we currently make and what we currently offer. And then we get sideswiped when the competition makes something oftentimes cheaper and better, because it addresses a base psychological need. So we want to understand the base psychological need, because then that gives us a very wide spectrum of how we can address that problem.
Got it. So Stuart, how about you unmute? That's you.
Yep, I'm here.
Hi.
I guess my question is maybe an observation. I'm not sure this is true. Do I get correctly that most of the product, I'll call it, that you're speaking about is something that can be acquired by the visitor, by the client, and used independently, yet you have some tracking mechanism built in so you can tell when they're using it. I'm not in a situation where I believe I would be using an independent product, perhaps a video that like Yifat curates hers online. That might be my one of my connections. How does that work if you're not providing a specific mechanical product? I'll call it mechanical. It's not a good word, but you get what I mean.
Yeah. So I think I know what you mean. So you're saying, do you have to get the user to put something into the product? Do you need that investment phase? And what we see is that is a critical component of creating a habit forming product. That, a lot of people think, well, to build a habit, all you need is to give people what they want, or, that's going to make your product something that's loved by your users. Just, give people what they want and you're done. But if you're not asking for that investment, if you're not asking them to put something into the product, you're leaving a huge opportunity on the table. And it really doesn't matter if it's a product or service. What matters is the frequency of use. So today, every business is a connected business. There are so many ways today to engage people outside of just the core experience, just the checkout. A lot of companies are so focused on getting people to buy the product, to check out, and they totally neglect to figure out ways to get them to check in. So that's a very important insight. Find ways to get people to check in. And the idea here is, what can you ask for the user? What can you get out of them in some form? Data, content, reputation, something that they put into the experience that makes it better and better with use. And there's lots of offline examples. Something as simple as a customer file. If you do business with somebody, it doesn't matter what business you're in. If you're a waiter at a restaurant, if you run a nail salon, it really doesn't matter what product or service you make. Are you taking the time to take out some customer information and use it to make the experience better next time? So, for example, if somebody comes to your hair salon, did you remember, their kids' ages and what they told you during the small talk? And that's what builds loyalty, right? Think about it. If you go out with a friend to lunch and you sit down together and you haven't seen each other in a while, and you start, telling each other what's going on in your life, you get a little vulnerable, you tell them about your struggles, your tribulations in work and business and in home life. And then the next time you see them, let's say you got to lunch again in a few weeks, and you realize they didn't remember a thing about you, right? You told them all this information about your life and they didn't care enough to bother to remember it. Well, either that person has amnesia or you're not going to be their friend for very long. And we treat our customers this way all the time. We are bad friends to our customers because we don't bother to take that information that they're making readily accessible and do something with it to improve the product with use. That is a huge missed opportunity that most companies out there do not take advantage of. They don't make the experience better with use because they don't bother to use that information. Now, of course, we have to be very careful and sensitive with that customer information. Back to that analogy I gave earlier, if we went out to lunch together and then I told another friend everything you told me, well, that would be a violation of trust, right? That would be a data leak, so to speak. So we have to be very careful and sensitive about how we use this data. But the biggest problem out there is that most companies don't bother to even collect this kind of information in the first place. They don't get the customer to invest in the product to make it better with use.
Hey, Yifat, may I ask one more question?
Yes, you may. There you go. Yes, you may. But I do want to go through the 5 whys model with Nir. So do you want to do that? And then dive into that? Or do you want to ask a question?
I guess this might fit into that. I don't know exactly what step. In terms of getting customer interaction, where you're talking about, sorry, I'm having a problem with my camera here. When you're talking about getting the investment back, could the investment be, this is one of the whys, could the investment be a reaction to the conversation or the video that just took place, where the viewer is deliberately asked, please send an email or whatever to tell me what you want next?
Sure.
What is it you want to see next?
Yeah, so there's two forms of investment. There's passive investment and active investment. So an active investment is what you just described. What did you just think of this experience? Let us know. It's an NPS score, it's an email, it's a survey, it's something that actively the customer has to do. Give me some information so we can make the product better with use. Now, this is typically pretty clunky, right? What tends to happen with an NPS score or an email is it gets aggregated, somebody reads it later, and then everybody gets together for a meeting, and then we try and figure out how do we make the product better, 6, 10, whatever number of months later, if ever. What we see these really innovative companies doing, and what we see is available now to small businesses as well, is a way to improve the product in real time with use. So you don't have to wait for a customer to tell you they like the video and take all that effort to send you that email. Remember, the harder something is to do, the less likely people are to do it. So if you take a company like Netflix, part of what makes Netflix such an amazing company and why they are so successful is that they are collecting all this passive investment based on where you're clicking, how long you watch something, right? They used to ask you thumbs up or thumbs down or how many stars. In the very beginning, they used to ask you how many stars to ask you how much you like the show. Now they don't even do that anymore. Now they know how much you like a show based on how much you watch. Well, that's a form of passive investment. You're getting data from the customer based on their usage of the product. And of course, that directly pipes into, in real time, what movies you're going to see, what options you're going to see the next time you engage with the product.
Yeah, I can see that playthrough. Got it.
So we're going to dive into great questions, Stuart. Guys, if you're just joining us right now, I'm.geek.com is where you can come in, hop on in, and have a conversation with us in real time. So let's do the 5 whys model with Michael, because Michael said he's trying to figure out what triggers can make people want to join his sleeping training. So Michael, how about you unmute? And we're going to go through the 5 whys model. So unmute. Let's see. Or do you want me to unmute you? Let's see. There you go. Can you hear? Nope. Yeah.
Nir, thank you. Very relatable sharing. Fantastic.
My pleasure.
I am in so many ways. So Yifat has nudged me out on this limb to generate a site that, or an opportunity for guests to better their sleep. And it pivots on an understanding about how metaphor works in dream to deactivate your emotions. And so I began with this fairly simple meditation process, and it kind of took it to a little protocol. It works very well. It simply is, in a way, helping people escape the unwanted feelings they've accumulated over the course of the day before they actually go to sleep. So they've gone ahead and done a little bucket brigade on that, and dedicated some time to sort of navigate that. And my meditation is essentially like a narration of a very generic process of how you would go about doing that for yourself, that I would love, that it would form a habit for them that either runs automatically for them, and that they may see other benefits to perhaps things like pain relief and other things that are just a consequence of the stress that they're in. Right. So when I really like the relevance of what you were saying is how to time that internal trigger. Like I'm restless, I'm feeling lousy, I've had a bad day, I can't get to sleep. Any number of those kinds of things to the behavior of actually going ahead and either, joining an interaction like this, or, ideally they're actually accessing a standalone downloadable bit of a 15 or 20 minutes of something that it would kind of coach them through a process. Mm-hmm. So you don't make the best judgments when you're already stressed. I'm just curious if you might think about this out loud with me. Yeah. How might I connect their timing of the experience at the end of the day with a resolution that they're seeking?
Sure. So there's a very low-hanging fruit around the external trigger. So that's what we're going to use to, remind people to get into this habit in the first place, so that eventually it becomes something that's attached to the internal trigger. But let's say the action is to open the app, is that right? It's open the app and listen to some kind of meditation. Is that?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay. So that's a pretty simple action. That's definitely something you can build a habit around. I love the fact that it's a frequently occurring behavior. This is something that occurs, I guess, every night, right?
Right.
And around bedtime, is that when
That's what I'm thinking.
Okay,
Right.
perfect. So we know right there that we have a situational cue, right? So that when you're near your bed or when it's a certain time of day, we're going to send you an external trigger and remind you about this action that you should take. Now, we do have to think about the internal trigger because eventually we want the person to remember to do this on their own. So let's do, for the sake of discussion here, what Yifat said around the 5 whys technique.
Okay.
Why would someone want to use your product at the base level? Let's start with the functional level. Why would someone want to use this app?
They're getting lousy sleep and experiencing, fatigue.
Okay, great. And so why is that important to them?
To be able to perform at a better level in the course of the day without, caffeinating or whatever.
Perfect. Okay, so that's 2 whys. Why do they want that?
Better judgment, better memory, feeling better about themselves.
Okay, and why would they want that? I guess that sort of alleviates a background self-doubt that where I'm supposed to be. Yeah. Okay. Great. I'm glad you made that leap. That's you see that pause there. That's terrific. You just went from the positive to the negative. Do you see what just happened there? You went from they want this and this to they don't want, right? Self-doubt. They fear something. And I think that's what we're getting to here very quickly is that it's self-doubt. It's fear. It's fear of not getting good sleep. And so that it took us less than 5 questions, but fundamentally we got to a feeling. Self-doubt is a feeling. It's an internal trigger. When you feel doubt, when you feel fear that you will not be able to rest tonight, that you will not be able to get the sleep you need, here's what you do. You use this product or service. And so if you can attach that, if that becomes your internal trigger, every time you fear not getting good sleep, open this app. That's a powerful, frequently occurring internal trigger.
Okay.
And what's good about that too, it's actually we've expanded beyond just the act of going to sleep, right? Wouldn't it be great if people use this app throughout the day, whenever they feel groggy, whenever they fear thinking about, what kind of sleep am I going to get later in the day? What if they check this app throughout the day to give them other tips? Is it okay to drink a cup of coffee based on the time of day? Or do you have any tips for me that could help me improve my night's sleep? Anything I could do?
Yeah, I saw this emerging in a recent conversation where we began to think about that you take moments of pause throughout the day, that you're actually setting yourself up for success by taking a minute here or there,
Yeah. So I think we got to this internal trigger. It's self-doubt. It's fear of not getting a good night's sleep. And it's funny that you mentioned this because this is a product that I use every day. I am habituated to this. This is called the Aura Ring. It's not jewelry. It actually has, I don't know if you can see it here, but it actually has little sensors inside the ring. And I wear it. I used to wear it only at night. Now I wear it all day long because it's a sleep tracking device. And I really love it. And if I don't have it, I am a little panicked. It's really helped me improve my sleep quite a bit. But if I don't sleep with it, I don't feel like I've gotten a good night's sleep, to the point where sometimes my wife will ask me, how'd you sleep last night? And I'll say, I don't know. I have to go look at my ring. My judgment, I can't just tell her what I think, because it turns out actually your sleep is quite complicated, that, you remember only the bad parts, but actually get really great sleep. Even though you woke up, 2 or 3 times a night, you might have gotten some really great REM sleep and deep sleep. So it's perpetuated. I mean, think about it. This Aura Ring, I think, is a terrific example of solving a similar problem. Not in the same way. I think you're guiding someone in terms of how to better fall asleep, whereas this is a sleep tracker for how did you sleep. But a very similar hook here exists, right? It's this fear of, how do I make sure I get a good night's sleep? The action is to wear the ring and go to sleep. The variable reward is opening the app the next morning and saying, how did I do? What's my score? How much deep sleep? How much REM sleep did I get? And the investment is the data I put into the product, right? The more days in a row that I've used this product, now I have this record of every time I've used it. And now I can't leave, because if I leave, all that data disappears. Right. And that prompts me, of course, to use it again in the future.
And do you at the end of the day, do you ever take a little inventory for yourself of, how rough a ride was it today, and how can I turn it around before I put myself to sleep?
So the Aura Ring doesn't do that in particular, and I think that's probably your opportunity, right? Because I had to use other tools to help me fall asleep faster. So that sounds like more like up your alley.
Okay. Yeah.
Was that helpful?
Absolutely. Yeah. I love the orientation to mood, to moving away from discomfort. I think that's all right on for me, at least. I appreciate this greatly.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm very glad. And keep in touch. I'd love to see where this goes next, because I think this is a product that can definitely help a lot of people.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Likewise.
So Kara is here in the green room with us, but she has dogs, so she asked me to ask you this. She actually saw you, Nir, at Qualtrics.
Yeah.
Am I saying it right?
Yeah, Qualtrics.
And she goes like, what is the emotion or the pain point? What if the emotion or the pain point is further removed from the reward, like home delivery of meals, like HelloFresh or Schwanz? So how do you get customers to try is easy, but repeating habit is hard. So how do you go about that?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge. One of the number one reason why I will tell a company that they're not going to form a habit is if the behavior does not occur with sufficient frequency. Larry Page, the CEO of Google, calls this the toothbrush test. He only wants to make products that are used as frequently as a toothbrush, twice a day. I relax that requirement a bit. I think once a week is really the cutoff. But if the product isn't used within a week's time or less, and that doesn't mean bought, by the way, the purchase is very different from the use of the product. But if the product isn't used frequently, it's very hard to turn it into a habit. And so what we see a lot of times happening is if there's a big lag between any of the 4 steps of the hook, if there's a gap between the trigger, the action, the reward, and the investment, then that degrades the ability to form a habit. So what you want to do is to find ways to increase the velocity through the hook in some way. So what happens, what we can do if a product itself can't become a habit because it's not used frequently enough, there's a few solutions. One of them being we can attach something that is habit forming, that does occur with sufficient frequency, onto something that isn't done with enough frequency. So I'll give you a quick anecdote. I spoke recently at a conference of 700 real estate agents. 700 real estate agents. And they brought me up on stage and they say, now we want to hear from Nir Eyal. He's a habit formation, and he is going to tell us how to make home buying and selling into a habit.
Oh, wow.
And I almost threw up. I was so nervous because I said, I'm so sorry. Maybe you hired the wrong person to come speak, but I am never going to tell you how to form a habit around buying and selling a home. It cannot become a habit. It's not something that occurs frequently. And it's something that we do with a lot of conscious thought, right? The definition of a habit is a behavior done with little conscious thought. So there's no way you're going to make a home buying and selling into a habit. And yet, I gave my presentation. I only had one talk at the time, so I couldn't come up with something on the fly. So I presented my hook model, and it was amazing because a lot of these real estate agents came up with ways to bolt on frequently occurring behaviors so that the result of engagement would eventually be monetization. Okay, let me say that again. It's a really important point. The result of engagement is monetization. So for example, we can get people to engage with our product in ways that may not necessarily have immediate a buying opportunity, but the result of all that engagement will eventually be that they'll buy from us. So let me give you 2 examples. Williams-Sonoma makes cookware, and that is not something that is bought once a week. That's never going to be a habit. But what they did, they discovered that if they made this website called taste.com, and they published all this great content about cooking and cooking related interest stuff, that by publishing this stuff frequently, they could form a habit with people who are enthusiasts of cooking related, recipes and interviews and all kinds of great content. And if they could get people habituated to consuming that content, the result of that would be that when someone in that audience wanted to buy something, guess who they were going to buy it from? Williams-Sonoma. So that's the content that we can bolt on. We can also bolt on community. So for example, if you can create a community around your product in some way, and the example here is the Hallmark Keepsake Ornament Club. 300,000 Americans are members of this club, and the club sells Christmas ornaments, right? Christmas comes once a year. How do you build a habit around that? Well, it turns out that there are so many members in this club, and they're very active. You can go to a Hallmark store in the middle of June, and you will see people lined up to buy these Christmas ornaments. Why? Because they're not there just for the Christmas ornaments. They're there also because Janice is going to be there, and Fred's going to be there, and all my friends are going to be there. They form this community that they engage with online and offline, and that's really what's being sold. It's this need to understand others and to be understood yourself. And so if you can bolt on content or community onto a product that's not used frequently, you can bolt on these habits so that the result of all that engagement will eventually be monetization.
You know, I love that you said that. This is exactly what I'm operating on. I love it. So before we end, what advice do you have for people who are, you know, just entering the market, kind of like Michael and Stuart here, and they feel that the market is saturated? You have the ring, right? There are solutions out there. You found other alternatives because, you know, you didn't have all the solutions in the ring. You said at the beginning that a lot of companies kind of screw up the engagement and the model. So how do you show the market that you have a better solution and they can come test you out and start with the whole hook process?
Yeah, so I think what you're kind of asking, I think, is how do you wrestle away the competition's customer habit, right?
Okay, fine, say it better than I can.
I think that's what you're asking is, you know, look, my competition already owns the habit. How do I get it away from them? And it is not easy. It's really difficult. It's great if you're the company that has the habit, but if you're the market entrance, how do you steal it from the incumbent? Yep. It's pretty hard to do, but there are 4 opportunities. There are 4 windows of opportunity where you can acquire the competition's customer habit. Let me fly through these real quick. Number 1 is if you can create a product that sends users through the hook with greater velocity. So if you can find a way to make going through those 4 steps faster, trigger, action, reward, investment faster than your competition, this typically happens when you make a product dramatically easier to use, okay? So that's opportunity number 1, greater velocity. The second opportunity is greater frequency. If you can figure out a way, typically this happens where there's some kind of interface change, like when we went from desktops to laptops to mobile devices and now wearable devices and now audible devices. Every time there's an interface change, computing became more ubiquitous. It was easier to engage with your Amazon Echo or your phone or whatever more frequently throughout the day. And that's a window of opportunity where a new market entrant can sneak in and steal away the incumbent's customer habit. The third opportunity is to make the reward more rewarding. And this is a tough one. Harvard Business Review did a study that found that a product can't just be a little better to get somebody to switch. It has to be 9 times better to escape the velocity of a habit. But that does happen every once in a while. Every once in a while, you'll have a product that's just so much better than the competition. It's so much better at scratching the customer's itch that they'll switch, making the reward more rewarding. And then finally, the fourth way is to make it easier to get into the product in the first place. If you can make it easier to enter the hook, so a good example here is Microsoft Office versus Google Docs. Remember, Google Docs, when it first came out, didn't have a fraction of the functionality that Google Docs, that Microsoft Office had, but it had a huge advantage in that Google Docs was in the cloud. Right. So it was free and there was no software. So if you were starting a company or you were a student and you just needed a quick spreadsheet or a word processor, it was easier to get into the hook of Google Docs than to go out and buy the software and download it and then put it onto your computer with a CD and all that stuff. So those are the 4 techniques: faster velocity, greater frequency, make the reward more rewarding, or easier entry into the hook. Those are the 4 ways to capture the competition's customer habit.
And let me just say that all that information is on Nir's website. You wrote an article about this, I think last week or something like that, right? How to steal your competitors' customers.
A few years ago, but it's there.
Well, I just saw it popping up for me. So yeah. So if you guys want to check that out and also download the Hooked workbook, to the right of the video, there's a link. You can go there and do all that stuff completely free. You can also have his course, Product Psychology, same site. Just download it and start using it. So now you've moved to a new book. You're writing a new book, and we're going to have a conversation about that.
Almost done. Yeah.
Almost done. Oh, so let's. And you did something like really, really cool. You did crowdsource some information, right? You actually went out to your users and you said, "Hey guys, do you want to help me proofread the book? Do you want to give me some input?" So you combined user data with data, right? Asking people. So just mention what the book is about. When should we expect it? Is there any pre-orders? How do we get on the list to find out
Yeah.
about that?
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, so the first book is this one behind me here, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. That's been available for a while. It's, of course, available on Amazon as well. And the next book is called Indistractable. Indistractable is about how do we control our attention and choose our life. It's for a much broader audience. It's not just for people who build products. It's for anybody who's struggled with, why don't I do what I say I'm going to do? I say I'm going to go to the gym. I don't. I say I'm going to eat healthy. I don't. I say I'm going to work on that big project, but instead I'm checking email and Slack channels. Why don't we do what we say we're going to do? And so the book is really about distraction at large. And so that's coming out in September. If you go to Nir and Far, Nir and Far is my website, spelled like my first name, Nir and Far, nirandfar.com. And if you sign up to the newsletter, you'll get all kinds of freebies, and you'll be notified when the book becomes available. And I'm very excited. September 2019, that book will be available.
Was there any surprise data that popped up from you asking your readers about the book to proofread it that you didn't expect?
Yeah, so I practice what I preach. So basically what I did was, I use what's called the IKEA effect. The IKEA effect says that we become more attached to something when we put work into it, right? Kind of like building IKEA furniture. You build that IKEA furniture, and even though it's kind of shitty furniture, because you built it, you keep it, right? Because
Totally.
you put it. And so a few things happened. Number one, I did it because the book got way better. I mean, I hired a professional editor, the publishers edited it. And yet I had this program where if you had to fill out a form, and if you were selected, only about, I think it was like 10% of people who applied were accepted. But if you were accepted, you could help me edit the document. So you got the first look at the content, and it got so much better. So that's the first reason why I did this crowd editing, was that by letting these hundreds of people look at the doc and help me with it, it got way, 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 way better. And then the second reason is that these are my super fans. These are the people who like the content more than anybody. And so I kind of built this, little army of folks who, they'll be the first to get their copies. And I put everybody's name. I did this with Hooked as well. If you were part of the program, of this contributor program, which was free, of course, I didn't charge and they didn't charge me. But the deal was that I put your name in the back of the book to thank you for helping me, make the book what it is. And so that's kind of the exchange. So a lot of benefits happen from using consumer psychology in this way.
What was the kind of like, oh, I didn't think that, I wrote it this way and people totally took it the wrong way, or people came up with things that I didn't even think about? Do you have that?
Yeah, there wasn't any big thing. What there was a lot of little things. As a writer, what you really want to make sure that you don't do is distract the reader. So, your choice of words, that your turn of phrase when somebody says, I don't know what that means, or, that for an international audience, they're not going to get what that is. That's a very American-centric reference, or, whatever it might be. You don't want the reader to go off track. You don't want your writing to get in the way of your message. And I think that was what was so helpful in doing this crowd editing technique was, if it's just you and an editor, which is the traditional way of writing a book, well, I'm the author, you're the editor, we're going to go with my way. But if 20, 30 people say, no, that sucked, that was really confusing, then as the author, you have to change it. So that was really helpful.
I love that. So thank you so much, Nir. This was I keep reading all the comments, eye-opening and very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to talking with you again about Indistractable, right?
We'll have to do that. That sounds great. Thank you so much for having me and for the great questions.
And thank you, guys. And if you want to get any of Nir's information right there to the right of the video, I will see you in 2 weeks on another show of I'mThatGeek.com. Bye.